When we talk to our kids about drugs or alcohol, whether they drink or they use drugs, they know what we think the problem with drugs and alcohol is. They know why we think it's not good. They know why we think they shouldn't be doing it, even if they are doing it. When we talk to our kids about the problem of gambling, we draw a complete blank. They have no idea what we're talking about, unless we're talking about you could gamble and lose so much money that you lose your parents' mortgage payment, if that makes sense to you. Unless you're talking about catastrophic losses, they have no sense of why you would think living in this world of betting on anything and everything is a problem.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Many people often talk about addiction and dependence, and in doing so, they may be using these terms inexactly. When it comes to gambling, however, those words are unfortunately correct. Problem gambling is a growing problem in the United States, particularly online gambling, which has been growing exponentially since the Supreme Court decided in 2018 that the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act violates the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. This in turn meant that states, rather than the federal government, would determine whether online sports betting would be legal. Since then, 38 states and the District of Columbia have legalized some form of sports betting, and 30 of those states permit online betting. Naturally, there has been an explosion in the amount of money wagered online. According to Forbes, $119.84 billion was spent on sports betting in the United States in 2023, which is a 27.5% increase from the year before. And this is often not innocuous fun. This past February, the Wall Street Journal posted an article entitled, "A Psychiatrist Tried to Quit Gambling. Betting Apps Kept Her Hooked." The article told the story of Dr. Kavita Fisher, a former high school valedictorian, who recently lost $500,000 in online betting apps. At one point, she even made it all back, going from $750 to $500,000 over 6 days. And even though logically she knew that she should have stopped so she could pay off her massive debts, she simply couldn't. A day later, she had lost almost all of it again. In her words, "There was just something in my brain that made me keep going." Even more problematic is that the online betting app that she used would entice her to keep going by giving her bonus money in order to get her back in when she was on a losing streak. Again, in her words, "I would have stopped a long time ago. Those VIP bonuses would get me back in." The Orthodox world is far from immune to the problems of extreme gambling. In fact, according to Dr. Rivka Schwartz, a higher percentage of modern Orthodox adolescents gamble than their age equivalents in the general population. I'm afraid that we're ignoring a problem that's going to grow significantly bigger in the near future, and I was honored to speak to Dr. Schwartz to learn more. We talked about the difference between gambling dependence and the so-called addiction to porn or the internet, the history of gambling in the United States and what has changed in the recent past, the data she has accumulated regarding modern Orthodox high school students and gambling, the problem that parents and educators have in explaining why this is a potential problem, what can be done if someone has a gambling problem, and how to determine if someone has developed a gambling addiction, and much more. We'll get to our conversation in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2024, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast. And JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Dr. Rivka Schwartz serves as Associate Principal, General Studies, and Co-Director of Machon Siach at SAR High School in the Bronx, New York. Dr. Schwartz earned a PhD in History of Science from Princeton University, writing her dissertation about the cultural history of the Manhattan Project. She has spent 20 years in Orthodox high school education, the last 15 in modern Orthodox co-ed high schools, and has served as an adjunct professor of history at Yeshiva and Stern colleges. She speaks and writes widely about issues of importance in the contemporary Orthodox community. Dr. Rivka Schwartz, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I reached out to you recently, Rivka, because of my suspicion that the legalization of sports gambling, along with its spread through apps like DraftKings and FanDuel, and the growing emphasis on gambling in regular media like ESPN Bet and so forth, means that we are likely going to have an epidemic of problem gambling in the United States, if it's not already there. And if it's a problem in the United States in general, it certainly will hit the Orthodox community as well. So I'd like you to open up with a history of gambling in the United States, and perhaps concluding with the Supreme Court decision of 2018 that permitted states to legalize sports gambling by declaring that the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act is unconstitutional.
Okay, so gambling in the United States was once treated as a vice. A vice means like a moral failing, something that you shouldn't do. And the government took upon itself to regulate vice. Similarly, at one point, the United States, even before national prohibition, many states banned alcohol, again, along similar lines, that drinking alcohol was morally bad and that it could be the government's role to ban things that are morally bad. Same way, there were various things that were sex crimes that are not crimes today, like adultery. Again, along the lines of something could be morally bad and it could be the government's job to ban it. And so because there were these laws that outlawed gambling, I mean, there's a whole interesting story that we're not going to talk about now about local subcultures of illegal gaming that was run locally because there was no big national gaming industry. Over time, your listeners are probably aware, right? Gambling was legalized first in two places, in Nevada and in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Those were the places you could go to gamble. And then gradually, in a very strange move towards reparations or compensation, because Native American tribes are legally sovereign nations. They're actually their own countries. They interact with the United States on a nation-to-nation level. Technically, if they wanted to, Native Americans could travel on their own passports, not on U.S. passports. Native Americans weren't even made citizens of the United States until the 1920s. Until the 1920s, Native Americans weren't citizens of the United States. So for all of those reasons, they are not bound by state laws barring gambling. And at some point, someone decided that it would be a way to kind of help Native American communities make up for all the financial losses imposed upon them to let them open casinos so that they could profit from doing that. That's its own whole history. Again, if you are familiar with some of the big Foxwoods and Mohegan Sun, other big casinos in the New York area that are owned by or Native American tribes, and those have their own whole fascinating history of how they have or have not benefited the tribes. But that was kind of the state of things. And over time, you've seen this sense of gambling as a vice erode, and states get into the gambling business more and more in the form of state lotteries. A state lottery is just gambling, legalized gambling. You've seen a lottery go from one once-a-week lottery ticket to lots of different lottery games that you play, scratch off an instant win, and all these other kinds of things, which are meant, and we're going to talk about this, exactly to stimulate the brain's reward centers and like, maybe I won this time. Let's see, did it hit? No, great. I can stand here right here in the gas station on the deli counter and buy another lotto ticket and another lotto ticket and another lotto ticket to see if I win. When I was in graduate school, when I was in college as an undergrad, I took one economics course as a required distribution requirement, gen ed requirement, one economics course. And my professor, Tom Bogart, I have no idea where he is or what he's up to in life, but I definitely remember that he said to the class that a lottery is a tax on people who can't do math. I mean, your odds are so incredibly low, but of course you don't hear that reported on the news. You hear the one guy who hit $100 million or $1 billion. So that feeds people's sense that maybe there's a chance and they keep gambling. So that was the state of play of things. Sports gambling, sportsbook was only legal if you went to Las Vegas. You were not legally allowed to gamble online because of the piece of legislation that you cited that banned online sports betting. And then in May of 2018, the Supreme Court ruled that you could not have that ban on sports betting, that ban on online sports gambling. That opened up the world of online sports gambling and all kinds of gambling in a way that it had not been. And as you've said, we've watched an explosion of gambling and a very rapid cultural shift around it. So we are all old enough, I mean, you and I are old enough to remember when athletes betting on games, even not their own games, was horrific and scandalous, and the integrity of the sport and the honor of the sport. And now you have the major sports leagues themselves cooperating with the big gambling companies, and you have ESPN partnering with the gambling companies, and you have an enormous amount of space being made for gambling, which is getting closer and closer to the athletes in very problematic ways. That's one kind of issue, but also means that what we're looking at now is the gamblingification of everything. So it's not just bet on the outcome of a game. If you watch a game, they give you the odds to bet on the next pitch and the next at bat and the next everything else. And what we're also seeing with our students is that is spreading more broadly into a culture of betting on yeshiva league sports, on the outcomes of all kinds of events, on all sorts of things. And we're just watching gambling becoming normalized as a part of everyday culture.
And we're going to get to some of that culture and some of the data shortly. I want to first ask about what you mentioned before in terms of your professor's idea that gambling is a type of tax on people who, or the lottery is a tax on people who can't do math. And what you said about the high, that dopamine hit, I'm guessing. You scratch off something and you might win something and you want another one and another one and another one. To what degree would you say that gambling is an actual addiction? And I'm using that term in a very specific way because it's a loaded term that's often misused.
Right. So I actually want to just back up for a second and just clarify. You misquoted me and then you accurately quoted me. He said a lottery is a tax on people who can't do math. There are forms of gambling. I'm not a gambler. I'm not a card game player. I've never been to a casino in my life. I don't know anything about anything. But there are some forms of gambling in which skill actually gets you someplace. You can be a better poker player than somebody else. There are other forms of gambling like slot machines, which are just completely random chance. I don't even understand the appeal except for what we're about to talk about. And that is prevention scientists are really reluctant to use the term addiction or dependency, which is maybe a more clinical term for talking about addiction, for most things that are behaviors. They don't, for example, though you'll hear people talking about sex addiction or pornography addiction, addiction researchers really are not at all convinced those things are addictions or that they operate by the same mechanisms in the brain that dependency on a chemical operates by. The one exception to this that I know of, that there's really clear consensus among researchers that this does operate in the brain the same way that chemical dependency operates, is gambling. It really is different than when we say somebody's addicted to pornography or addicted to the internet, or certainly when parents talk about their kids being addicted to devices. And that is that there is something about the risk of it and then the reward and then the anticipation of future reward, which actually engages the brain and the brain chemistry in a similar way that consuming mind-altering substances does. And what that does is that creates a loop in which I play the game. Of course, I didn't win. Creates me a greater desire to win next time. I play again, and that risk and those intermittent rewards when I do actually win are so rewarding that I keep on playing, keep on trying to win more.
Let me ask something about that, and I don't know if you can answer this, but when you mentioned before the difference between, say, a poker player where skill is part of the game, even though it also involves some luck, versus something like a slot machine, which is the epitome of pure blind chance. And of course, sports betting falls somewhere in the middle. It might actually be much more blind chance, but people think that they have information. They think if they know enough about the players, they're likely to know better. And maybe they're right. I don't know. But it certainly isn't as much as they think it is. Is that also the same kind of addiction, or are these different addictions? Because they seem almost like different types of things.
Yeah, I don't know enough about that to kind of differentiate in that way. And I'm not sure that the researchers differentiate in that way, to be honest. I haven't seen gambling research that breaks it out to that level of what exactly you're gambling on, which is not to say that it doesn't exist. To be perfectly transparent with your listeners, I am a high school educator and I moonlight as a prevention researcher. We can get around to talking about that. I've been involved in a major prevention research project in the Modern Orthodox community since we started in 2017, 2018. So for a while now, but I'm not somebody who spends her time doing research on gambling. But as you said, there's a long history of evidence in New York State. Some of you who might remember the days when you were allowed to gamble on horse racing, but only if you went to official state licensed parlors called OTB, off-track betting parlors. And you'd see these guys lined up in the OTB parlors with their little pieces of paper. They placed their bets, waiting to see on live video feeds from the racetrack what happened. Horse racing, people were always convinced that they knew more, had insider information, would be able to bet more successfully. And of course, it turns out when you look at the data that it doesn't really end up being the case. But that is different than certain card games that might actually be games of skill.
So before we get to the data when it comes to high school students in the Orthodox world, I want to ask you first about just a general feeling about some of these companies like FanDuel and DraftKings, others that I mentioned, and many more, of course. From what I've read and what I mentioned in my introduction, it seems that these companies are actually preying on those people who are more likely to become addicted. Have you heard anything about that as well?
These companies are preying on people. There's not much else to say. And the fact that they give you some gobbledygook, very quickly mumbled disclaimer, and if you think you may be a problem gambler, please call them 1-800, whatever it is, help me solve my gambling problem, does not take away from the fact that they are preying on people. we live in a capitalist economy in which companies can make profit from whatever it is they're able to make profit from. We know that the Sackler family made billions and billions of dollars seeding the opioid epidemic in the United States that's killed millions of people, right? Juul made a lot of money getting a lot of kids hooked on vaping. So our economy allows for this. And we have data now. The study just came out last month that in states where they've allowed gambling more, you see bankruptcies go up and credit ratings go down. It is very clear the impact that this has on people, because that lure of just next time I'm going to win that big, whatever it is, that big prize, that big jackpot, that big, whatever the correct term of art is, and that's going to make up for all of my previous losses, so incentivizes you to keep on going and keep on going and keep on going in ways that can be profoundly harmful.
In that case, let's get into some of the data right now. Could you present the data that you found regarding Orthodox kids?
Yeah. So just to back up a little bit, I work at SR High School, and I also work in Machon Siach at SR High School. Machon Siach is the research arm at SR High School. We're very lucky as a school to have the opportunity to step back from the day-to-day of teachers and classes and curriculum and think about the big questions that affect education and kids in our community, and to have the time and space to look into those. And really, it's a big chunk of years ago already. It's the summer of 2017. Our founding principal of SR High School, Dina Machon Siach, Rabbi Tilly Hartstark, said, we really should think about kids and party culture. What kids do to cut loose, to relax in their spare time seems to be problematic. Too much substance use, too much unhealthy behavior. We should look at that. Through a long sequence of events that you don't want me to narrate here, we ended up enlisting other schools who were similarly interested in thinking about this problem and eventually doing a survey. We surveyed for the first time in February of 2019. And then again, we surveyed in February of 2020 and February of 2023. We will survey again this coming year in February of 2025, gathering data on thousands of kids from across, depending on the year of the survey administration, it's been between 17 and 20 modern Orthodox high schools. And so we have really robust data, not just of a slice of our community, but we're looking broadly at much of the modern Orthodox community in the United States. And although we had intended the survey to look at party culture and substances, we didn't write our own survey. This is not us making up a SurveyMonkey survey. We used a national survey called the Prevention Needs Assessment, administered by a survey and research firm in Utah called Bach Harrison. And their survey, many questions about substance use, many questions about kids' emotional well-being, connection to adults around them, all kinds of other things, and questions about gambling. And we discovered that the rates of gambling in our community were higher than the national average. And again, our community, I do not mean the SAR community. I don't have specific data about the SAR community. I mean, among adolescents in the modern Orthodox community, more gambling than in the country as a whole, which I could easily make up an explanation for, which is that by socioeconomic status, modern Orthodox Jews are wealthier than the country as a whole. In order to gamble on FanDuel or DraftKings, you need a credit card. You also need to lie and say you're 21, but okay, whatever. You need a credit card. And you need to be able to spend money on that credit card in a way that somebody doesn't notice the instant that you spend $25 too much, right? You could imagine a parent who's given a kid a credit card who might not notice if the kid spends $100 more, $200 more, maybe $300 more than they told them they could spend. At what point do the numbers get to a point that the parent's like, wait a second, what's going on here? And if they don't reach that point, then maybe parents not even paying attention. You need to be at a certain level of socioeconomic status for that to be the case. Again, I don't know that that's the explanation. That's a hypothesis that I have that makes sense. One other thing we saw from the data that's very interesting, when it came to drinking, the results were not as gendered as I might have expected them to be. While boys do drink a little bit more than girls in our community, it's not enormously much more. The gambling numbers were wildly gendered. It was overwhelmingly that boys gamble and not girls. Again, I think pretty obviously, because in our community, the kind of gambling that's going on is not going to a casino and playing the slots. It's sports gambling, and it's sports gambling online. And that's where the overwhelming gambling numbers are coming from. Even the first survey we did in February of 2019 was half a year after the Supreme Court lifted the restrictions on online gambling. And since then, it's only gone further down that path.
Let me ask about those numbers then. You say that the Orthodox adolescents, specifically male Orthodox adolescents, are gambling at a higher rate than the national average. But I'd also like to know if the national average is 2% and this is 2.5%, that might not be good, but it's not very high. Do you have specific numbers to talk about how many of our kids are gambling and how many are problem gamblers?
Yeah, so it's not a majority of the kids. It's certainly not a majority of the kids. The questions are meant to sift out. If you once a year bet on the Super Bowl, That's not the same kind of thing as you're regularly betting online, or you participate in a March Madness pool. And so the questions do try to get at that. I don't know that the questions identify problem gamblers as such. They don't ask questions like, have you ever gone into significant debt because of gambling? But they do ask about different types of gambling in pretty specific detail about exactly what kinds of gambling you're doing. And again, we have some kind of data about the prevalence of it, the types of what's going on. And it's not a majority of the kids, but it is a very significant number of the boys. And we're also concerned about a gambling culture, by which I mean this. I could say in a vacuum, okay, once a year for March Madness, for NCAA men's basketball tournament, kids make up brackets and adults make up brackets. Barack Obama publishes his NCAA bracket every year. And that's really pretty harmless in and of itself. You put $5 into a pot. Even if you believe that's pretty harmless, at a certain point, we start to feed into a culture where betting on sports and the outcome of sports is okay. And we're not communicating clearly what the problem is. Here's the thing. When we talk to our kids about drugs or alcohol, whether they drink or they use drugs, they know what we think the problem with drugs and alcohol is. They know why we think it's not good. They know why we think they shouldn't be doing it, even if they are doing it. When we talk to our kids about the problem of gambling, we draw a complete blank. They have no idea what we're talking about, unless we're talking about you could gamble and lose so much money that you lose your parents' mortgage payment, if that makes sense to you. Unless you're talking about catastrophic losses, they have no sense of why you would think living in this world of betting on anything and everything is a problem. And if we have a culture where some amount of gambling is okay, now I think some amount of drinking is okay. I once got edited out of a podcast for saying that for adults, some amount of responsible marijuana use might be okay. It's interesting. They were okay with me saying that some amount of drinking is okay, but not with me saying responsible marijuana use for an adult is not worse than responsible drinking for an adult. So that was an interesting experience. So you want to say that some amount of gambling is okay, but then you have to explain to your kid why betting on March Madness or the Super Bowl as a once a year, low stakes kind of fun thing is a thing we can do responsibly, but constantly betting on every aspect of our lives. Here's why I think it's problematic. I'm not even sure that parents have language to talk about why it's problematic. And I'm pretty sure that none of us is communicating to kids a value around why that kind of living in a constant game of chance is problematic, especially if we don't think that it's problematic if you gamble once or twice a year on some big sporting event and we aren't explaining to our teenagers what the distinction is there and how this is not a risky or unappealing or morally problematic behavior, and that is.
Can you then explain to our listeners why, or specifically how, a parent could explain the problem of gambling, to say why it is different if you bet on things, even if you're winning, why this is not a value, this is not something which we want. If the kid says, hey, I haven't lost money, in fact, I've made money, why is that a bad thing? What would you tell that kid?
Great. So that is a great question. And I want to start by not pretending that I do something I don't do. We in SAR, who are sitting on this data, have been doing this work, still have a hard time talking to our kids about the values around this because it's so disconnected from them. We kind of keep talking about it. We haven't really come up with a great, I just want to say this very honestly. We have a great curriculum that we've developed in SAR, really an outstanding curriculum. We're talking to students about Torah values around sexuality. Side note, if your listeners want it, reach out to me. I'm happy to send it to you. We teach a half-year course in SAR to 10th graders, separated by gender, Torah values around sexuality. We've done the work, we have the curriculum. We don't have that around gambling. But I want to say a few things. Obviously, we're already back in the Mishnah, right? That people who gamble are pasul eidos. They're not eligible to be witnesses. Say men who gamble are not eligible to be witnesses. Women are not eligible to be witnesses anyway. We've had some exchanges around language and that kind of thing. Why? What's the assumption in the Mishnah? I think that at least one interpretation of the assumption is the people who lose money to you never really expected to lose the money. And therefore, when you take the money from them, you are some measure stealing from them.
That certainly, as I've heard it, the most common reason why it's technically forbidden, even if it's not talking about a value. It's a kind of stealing, essentially.
Right. So we talk to kids about that. We talk to kids about what you end up in. We have had, by the way, I'm not going to pretend this is widespread or commonplace, but we have had cases of kids losing lots of money to their own detriment. And we have even had cases of kids dunning other kids for large sums of money that were lost to them in gambling bets in school that we've had to step in when we found out of it and say, oh no, you cannot collect an $800 gambling debt from another student in your class. Even if you say to me they lost it to you fair and square, that's not how we roll. So that kind of thing, losing money, taking money, even if you don't get to, you'll risk your parents' mortgage payment. That's not the kind of, that sort of thing is easier to explain. The next order thing, which is harder to explain, is training your brain, right, on this, the risk and the hit, if I got a reward, or the disappointment, but I'll try again. And the dream of the, right, the one big hit that's going to make it all of that. And again, I don't just mean the dream as a kind of emotional or mental state. I actually mean it as the physiological state of your brain that's craving the hit that comes from that your brain chemistry experiences when you win, and that is both undesirable on a health level, but that's also not how we want to live our lives. I can never enjoy the baseball game itself that I'm sitting at and watching, because all I care about is if I won money or I lost money on the game. I can never just sit and be enjoying the activity I'm doing. What makes the activity enjoyable to me is if I have the risk of having money riding on it. I'm not sure that's a simple thing to explain to an adult. It certainly doesn't feel like it's a simple thing to explain to a 16-year-old. When you can no longer enjoy anything you're doing in life, unless it's a game of risk or reward financially, that doesn't seem to be a way to be in the world. Every single thing is a bet. I'm not sure that kids are going to totally get that. And then there's the brain chemistry piece, and then there's the money and who you're taking it from, and the winning and losing piece. And the last piece, which I said is the easiest to sell to them, even if it doesn't happen to too many people, is sometimes people do lose their mortgage payments, right? That's not a made up thing. I just told you the data show that in states that most relax the rules on gambling, there are more bankruptcies and lower credit scores. So that too is it, right? They wouldn't be putting all that mumbledy-jumbledy and super high speed with the 800 number that you can't even hear about what to do if you're a problem gambler if there weren't people who are problem gamblers. And so all of those things I would think are things that should be communicated to kids. Right now, I'm not sure any of those things is being communicated super effectively to kids. And I'm not sure in schools, I'm not sure in homes. And meanwhile, as you said, the ads are everywhere. You cannot turn on a sports game without, or go to a sports game or anything without seeing odds posted and advertising for betting companies. And really, it has transformed what it means to participate in sports.
If I'm understanding you correctly, it sounds like the problem in teaching it is largely because it's difficult to articulate a positive value that is represented by not gambling. It's things that you don't want to be this, you don't want to be this, but it's hard to say you want to be a something. Is that part of what you're talking about in terms of the difficulty in conveying it?
I think it's hard to articulate a positive value. I even think it's hard to articulate a negative value of gambling. Again, as I've said, you can articulate you're going to lose your parents' mortgage payment on their house. You shouldn't be living in a life where the only things that make it interesting are that you have money at stake, is a pretty abstract kind of thing. And like, let's be real. I don't have these data about gambling in particular, but when it comes to substance use, we do have from our survey great data about the power of adult modeling. And that's to say that our data are about adults, not who drink in front of kids. Adults can drink responsibly. I did that before. I don't have to say that again. But it's about adults who get drunk in front of kids. And it turns out from our survey that a lot of our kids are seeing a lot of adults around them consume substances to the point of intoxication, losing control of their faculties. And that communicates to kids more powerfully than our words ever can what we think about substance use and excessive consumption of substances. Similarly, I think there are some kids in our community who are seeing adults around them engage in exactly this kind of gambling on the next pitch, on the next at bat, on the next whatever it's going to be. So they see that, and they see that as being something that adults around them engage in. And also, we don't articulate our values to our kids. So if my kid sees me gambling once a year on the Super Bowl, again, as I said earlier, I don't explain to my kid why I think it's okay to do that and not be engaged in this constant FanDuel DraftKingsification of every aspect of my life. And in the absence of communicating that, I just don't think our kids begin to understand what we're talking about. And again, maybe part of the communication is that we ourselves don't have clear language to articulate that, even if we are the parents who feel it, even if we are the parents who aren't gambling in excessive ways.
Not to mention the fact that in popular culture, I think that drug abuse and alcohol abuse are seen in popular culture as broadly negative, even though there might be party culture, but they're seen when people get completely blackout drunk. That's not considered in popular culture a good thing by and large. However, constantly, as you say, over the past since 2018, the constant ads for betting, this is simply what you do. This is the way you do it. This is the way you have fun. This is how you make the game. You know, adults say, let's make this interesting. That sort of thing cannot be helping whatsoever. It's got to make it hard.
Yeah, there's the broader relaxation of cultural norms against gambling, of seeing gambling as a vice, which is completely gone now. The Poker World Series being a huge event and being broadcast, and you can watch it, and all of these sorts of things have really, really shifted the popular conversation around this in a way that if you, again, try to raise gambling as a vice, as a negative thing that you should engage in, I think many people would not understand what you were talking about. One of my kids once went to a school. I'm going to try to be vague about this, but I'm not going to try too hard to be too vague, to be honest. One of my kids once went to a school where they honored someone at the dinner. You know, the whole discussion, do you honor only wealthy donors? Do you honor people who contribute to the community? Do you try to find wealthy donors who also contribute to the community? They honored a young man who was in his 20s. So he hadn't really contributed all that much to the community. He was a parent in the school. This is a matter of public record. If you want to go look up these articles, you can find them in the New York Times, who had bet a significant sum of money on a particular issue within a sports game. It wasn't even the entirety of the outcome of the sports game. It was how the first points in the sports game would be scored. And he won a significant sum of money on that bet, which he then donated to the yeshiva. And the yeshiva was happy to honor him at their dinner. This person, who at that point was not a figure of great note or contribution in the community, was a figure who had achieved that bit of financial success on the back of a bet on a football game. So I guess you could say if he was going to bet anyway, at least he donated the money to a Torah institution. I mean, I guess so. You know, that he was subsequently arrested for illegal activity and like that, I guess is just icing on the cake. But I do think it raises a question of how in our community we regard and relate to people who are engaging in this activity. And do we treat it as though it's problematic? And do we relate to it that way and talk about it that way?
I mean, if I really want to get into this, and frankly, Rivka, when I was preparing for our talk today, I didn't think about this, but as you're speaking right now, I am thinking about it. I'll call it a slippery slope. I'm not sure that's the right term. The fact of the matter is that in the Orthodox community, like in many communities, we have all sorts of rich people who got rich on the stock market, which is in some ways a form of gambling. It involves some skill, of course, but ultimately there is a lot of luck involved. There's a lot of investing money in something where you do not know what is actually going to happen. And it's really, on some level, the same thing, don't you think?
Oh, you are not going to find a lot of disagreement here about the financialization of our economy over the last generation or more is really a very, very large scale kind of gambling, meaning the turning of the entire, when I say financialization of the economy, I mean things like the percentage of Harvard graduates who are leaving Harvard and who are going into Wall Street or finance in some way, rather than the percentage of Harvard graduates leaving Harvard going into law and medicine. You can look up these data, they're widely available. The enormous financialization of the economy over the past 40 years was connected to the enormous concentration of gains at the very top, because in those industries, people can make sums of money that lawyers and physicians can only dream about. And the way in which that kind of activity is not fronting the money so that somebody can start a new company. This is not venture capital, right? This is often just placing large bets on minute swings in this or that. And I think that's related in many ways to all kinds of really unhealthy things in our culture and politics that we could talk about, but that is a very big topic and gets us to lots of other places. There's also the interesting thing that when people who play that kind of game, where the sums of money are unimaginably vast, when they make the money, they pocket it. And when they lose the money, we say, oh, but their institutions are vital for the economy. We can't let them go under. And the federal government bails them out with my tax dollars. So I have lots of thoughts about a gambling system that's set up, so that heads you win and put the money in your pocket, tails, I, the taxpayer, I'm left holding the bag. And that probably politically took you to a place where you didn't expect that this was going to go. But I think that a lot of the anger that was reflected in the 2016 presidential election, that was reflected both in the surprising success of Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary and in the ultimate success of Donald Trump in the Republican primary, was reflecting people who were looking back at the 2008 financial crash and saying the system was totally rigged. Millions of Americans lost their homes and giant banking firms got bailed out and made whole. And I think there was one bank executive who went to prison. I think there was a single one. And everybody else was just Jim Dandy.
With their golden parachutes.
So that is a whole other topic of conversation, not our topic here, probably in some way connected to the ways in which risk-taking and gambling are not seen as activities of vice, but sort of beyond my pay grade to analyze how those connections work.
Okay, definitely worth talking about a different time. Let's get back to gambling in particular, specifically gambling among modern Orthodox. And let me just make sure. The data you're talking about is largely modern Orthodox or centrist Orthodox. Is that correct?
Data are right. When I say modern Orthodox, I include centrist Orthodox. It sounds like a very weird criterion to use, but in a way, it's like in the New York area, it's schools that play together in the Yeshiva League, play sports against each other. It's like schools that march in the Salute to Israel parade. So that includes single-sex schools like Berea and JEC, SKA and DRS, for those of you, I don't know if this is too New York specific, participated in our surveys. And then big co-ed schools, Ramaz, SAR, Shalhevet High School in Los Angeles, Ida Crown in Chicago, also participated in our surveys. Again, depending on the years between Yeshiva Flatbush, I should have named them, was a founding collaborator with us in this from the very, very beginning. And so it's a range of schools, depending on the years, between 17 and 20 high schools. Again, we did the surveying 3 times, so it's not a set number of schools. Some schools join, some schools leave. We're hoping for a few more schools by the time we survey in February of 2025. If you run a Modern Orthodox or centrist Orthodox high school or middle school, you want to get in on the survey and contact me about that also. So 17 to 20 high schools means that we're not just covering a slice of the community, that is most of the centrist and Modern Orthodox community in the United States.
Then let me ask, because you've done the survey several times, and we also talked about that Supreme Court decision in 2018, have you seen a rise in gambling over that time, or has it been consistently high from the start?
Okay, so this is a very in the weeds answer. So you'll tell me if you think it's interesting or not, but it's the only way I can answer your question. The earlier administrations of the survey, the gambling questions were part of that survey that I told you, the Prevention Needs Assessment Survey from Bach Harrison. Eventually, the PNA cut out the gambling questions because apparently nobody but us was interested in the gambling data. And we then added the gambling questions as our own questions at the end of the 2023 survey. They were no longer included in the main survey. They were added at the end. But here's what happens. There's something called survey fatigue. A student is sitting and filling out a 200 question survey. By the time they get to the questions at the very end, we get fewer answers. So that's just the thing that happens on surveys. We added questions at the end that were about kids' religious observance and engagement, a few other things that we thought were important. And we did that from the beginning when we did the surveying. But there are many fewer kids who answer those questions all the way at the end than the questions at the beginning. So the answer to your question is we moved the gambling questions from being in the middle of the survey to being added questions on the end. And we don't yet have enough years of the gambling survey the questions in the same place in the survey to give us clarity about the trends, because we made a big change in the middle of surveying that affected the numbers that we got.
Okay, I understand that. Then let me ask something else. In talking about addictive or dependent behavior, do you think there's any correlation between people who abuse drugs and alcohol and those who become serious about gambling?
That's an interesting question. I probably have the data to that because part of our data analysis is to correlate the answers from one question to the answer to another question. So of the kids who say they use drugs, how many of them have gambled? I have never looked at those crosstabs of drugs and gambling or alcohol and gambling. I probably should. So we have that data has been generated. I haven't examined it, so I don't know it. I couldn't tell you right now. I could find it out.
Let me go back to something you said before when you mentioned that, for example, drinking, there's nothing wrong with having a glass of wine. That's not considered problem drinking. The problem is when parents or authority figures get drunk in front of the kids. Because it's so hard to communicate exactly what's wrong with gambling, and because we have not yet found an effective method of explaining what values are involved and exactly what the problem is, do you think, therefore, this is an opinion question, not a data question, that it's smarter for people to avoid even the NCAA pool or the yearly bet on the Super Bowl and say, we just don't gamble? I'll give you an example of my own life. I had made a decision 30 years ago that even if I have a sip of wine, I won't drive. I know that's not legally necessary. It's not even psychologically or physiologically necessary. It's my own personal chumrah. Do you think that this is a smart thing for people to do when it comes to gambling? To say, you know what? Because we don't know how to communicate it effectively, let's just not do it kihuza.
So this is a super interesting question and gets into a really, really big philosophical question about addictive behaviors in general. Your listeners are probably very familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step programs that are extremely bashita, that the only safe amount of alcohol for an alcoholic to consume is 0. And if you have any sip of alcohol, you can relapse totally. That is Alcoholics Anonymous' position. It is not all people in prevention work or dependence research or treatment works position at all. And there are people who say that's such a high bar and it's not sustainable. It makes life so difficult for people in social settings. And you actually can have a kind of managed, responsible use, even for people who've had dependence problems in the past. And again, other people like Alcoholics Anonymous say absolutely not. That's not possible at all. So that's a broader question. I want to give you actually a pragmatic answer. And my pragmatic answer is this. I think that if we start talking about teetotaling, about going cold turkey, about anything, whether it's alcohol, whether it's marijuana, whether it's gambling, there are going to be a lot of people who think that I may scold, nanny state, telling you what to do, taking away all your fun. They might not be wrong about that. I am probably, in fact, a scold nanny state, telling you what to take away all your fun.
Like the federal government used to be.
Like the federal government or state governments. A lot of this happened through the states. But yeah, the law you're talking about was a federal law, but there were also state laws about it. By which I just mean that I will admit to your listeners, I told you I've never gambled. I've never been in a casino. I don't bet on March Madness. I also don't drink. I also don't use other substances. I'm a very boring square person. And so I don't really want to be walking around telling other people for whom this is something in their lives that provides them pleasure. You absolutely cannot do it. Let me put my glasses down on the end of my nose and yell at you. I'd rather say to them, let's think about what we want for our kids. What kinds of outcomes do we want for our kids? I've never met a parent who says, I really want my kid walking around hooked to his FanDuel, betting on which color car is going to be the next car to pass him on the street. No parent wants, and he can't enjoy life unless he's betting on which color car is the next car to pass him on the street, because otherwise life seems too low stakes and too low risk to be enjoyable. What do we want for our kids? How do we help our kids get to what we want for them? How do we talk to them in a way that communicates to them what we value and what we want and what we hope for them? And then to help them get there. And if we say that, I'm not yelling at you, and I don't want you to be yelling at your kids. I want us to be thinking about the things we care about and value, and whether we're always communicating that to our kids. Because sometimes there are things we deeply care about and value, and we don't communicate to our kids, either because in gambling, we don't know quite how to communicate it, or in sex, because it's an awkward conversation to have, or in money, because we're super private about it and we don't share that information with our kids. And so there are really important things we're not talking to our kids about.
Okay. What are the ways to recognize if anyone really, but we're speaking about kids here, has a problem with gambling? If the kid is gambling, if lots of kids are gambling, there is only so much we can do about that particular phenomenon. But what is a sign that somebody, aside from obviously losing their house, short of that, what's a sign that someone actually has a problem?
So I want to say a very simple thing about kids. Kids shouldn't be able to hide problem gambling for very long. Meaning a kid has a parent's credit card, or a kid has their own credit card the parent is paying the bill on. A kid has, yes, there might be some kid somewhere who's selling sneakers to finance their habit. Granted, most kids are not selling sneakers to finance their gambling habit. Most kids are getting money from their parents, and their parents either aren't paying careful enough attention to where the money is going, or maybe the kid is even making up a cover story and the parent is buying it. The first thing I would say to a parent is, if you're giving your kid a credit card, either there's a limit on how much they could spend on it, or you're paying attention to the statement, or both. And if there's large unexplained sums of money, you're asking your kid about it. And if it repeats a second month, you're saying, what exactly is going on here? I think that when it comes to kids as problem gamblers, in virtually every case, again, there might be one kid somewhere who has their own business that's financing this. In virtually every case, they're doing it with their parents' money. And parents can be paying attention to that, can be monitoring that, and can be cutting that off. If a kid used your credit card to sign up for FanDuel, don't let them use your credit card to sign up for FanDuel. And if they have your credit card because they need to have it for a lot of other reasons, again, you can be monitoring, paying attention to, be on top of that.
So my final question for you, Rivka, is this, and I know you're not in this conversation as a therapist, but maybe you can give an answer nevertheless, or you can say that you're not qualified to answer. If someone is identified as having a gambling problem, we're not talking about prevention. We're talking about dealing with an existing problem. What's the way of dealing with that?
Okay. I'm not a therapist, but I will say broadly again, from the field of people who work on dependence, we started this conversation by talking about vice and by talking about treating certain things as vice. And that's what we talk broadly and societally. But talking about individuals, actually, researchers who deal with dependence of various sorts very much have moved away from a vice kind of model. Oh, he drinks because he's a drunk. He's a drunkard. He's an alcoholic. Oh, she uses drugs because she's weak-willed and she doesn't have the moral whatever to resist. That's not at all how we view this now, right? We view this as a dependency that some people will develop because of genetic predispositions, because if they expose themselves to the substance, they can develop a dependency. And we have to figure out how to treat that dependency, not blame the person who has it. And so I would actually, having started off by talking about gambling as a vice, maybe this sounds inconsistent or incoherent, but I would say the first step to treating somebody with this is not to say, and I'm sure it's very tempting if you find out your child has just lost $800 on a bet, on a gambling bet, or is involved in some unsavory behavior with maybe unsavory people as a result of gambling, is to say, how could you, and didn't I teach you better than this, and didn't I raise you better than this, and have you no moral fiber, and et cetera, and et cetera. But I think if we recognize that this can actually be a dependence, like substance use is a dependence, then we can approach it that way, which is, how do we get you help? Not how do we scream at you, not how do we deride you as being morally compromised, but how do we get you help?
Now, I said that was my last question, but I actually have one more question I want to ask you. And it was something you referenced at the beginning of our conversation about corruption. You talked about in sports, for example, the idea that, I'm thinking of Pete Rose, how Pete Rose gambled on baseball, he bet on baseball, and the only sign, I believe, in every single major league clubhouse is a sign saying you may not gamble on baseball, and he therefore was thrown out of the game and is not in the Hall of Fame, etc. because of the corruption that's involved. So I'm going to ask you a devil's advocate type of question. Some people will say that the reason that, and you talked about the issue of vice, and this is related to that, the reason that there was so much crime vis-a-vis drugs is because drugs are illegal. And maybe the way to take it away from being a problem is to legalize marijuana and other drugs, and then we can deal with it, at least on a legal level. We can try to monitor it on that level. Is it possible? Is it possible that somebody who wants to say that there's too much gambling now says, yes, but at least they're not doing it with a bookie. They're doing it legally. They're not dealing with the underworld. There's no connection to the mafia anymore, at least not openly. And therefore, these people who are problem gamblers would have been problem gamblers before. The difference is they would have been problem gamblers who would have their kneecaps broken if they messed up. And now they're losing money, but it's not the same kind of criminal activity. Is there anything to that or not?
There is something to something there, but it's a little bit complicated to parse out because we talked earlier about the profit motive. As long as big corporations are making money off of these behaviors, they have the incentive to increase them as much as possible. The model of harm reduction does say that criminalizing a substance and punishing the people who use it is not, and arresting them and jailing them is not doing anybody any good. And, having in the sort of far end of the harm reduction model, you have supervised use sites. You can come inject heroin in this facility safely so that we will make sure we're not giving you the heroin, but if you're using it anyway, you can use it here safely. I happen to live in very close proximity to one of the first 2 safe injection sites in the United States. It's an interesting experience. We could talk about it some other time. But the idea of a safe injection site is let's at least make sure you don't die of an overdose while you're using. Again, I don't want your listeners to get distracted by the thought of a safe injection site. But the point of the story is that there is a model of harm reduction that says don't punish, don't criminalize, don't drive underground. That would have to be coupled with a not-for-profit replacing FanDuel and running it not as a money-making business. The fact that it's run as a money-making business means the gobbledygook disclaimer aside, their incentive is only to drive up use and drive up use and drive up use and drive up use. This is not just about let's not criminalize, right? Okay, not criminalize, but we've gone all the way to the other extreme, which is let's incentivize as much as possible. I could conceivably think of some kind of neutral ground, which is let's not criminalize, let's not incentivize. The people who use, will come to use anyway, will use in a relatively safer way. Again, I don't exactly know what a, not criminalized, not incentivized gambling model would look like. We could imagine what it would look like for substances. Right? Not criminalized, not incentivized, for example. Okay, side note, not going to make me popular with your listeners. The alcohol tax in the United States has been stagnant for decades. It has not gone up. It's not gone up with inflation. And therefore, compared to 30 years ago, the alcohol tax is actually lower because the value of the tax in real dollars has decreased. All prevention scientists think the alcohol tax should be increased. It's very clear. If you make alcohol more expensive, people drink less of it. And so it's a very simple, very easy prevention measure to just hike up the tax on alcohol. It hasn't happened for all the reasons it hasn't happened. And so there are things, if we were talking about a model of decriminalizing but disincentivizing, there would be real ways to do that, to raise the cost, to not have for-profit corporations pushing it. But the idea of the Wild West, we're selling heroin on every street corner, come one, come all, have a great time, and it's legal, and we're hanging out our awnings, I don't know, that's going to be such a great thing. And I say this as somebody who really could be, I've been learning a lot about prevention science these past bunch of years. I'm very persuaded by many of the claims of the harm reduction people. Certainly I'm persuaded that the penalizing and, in the criminal legal system, that looks like imprisoning. In our system, it looks like punishing kids when we find out that they're using rather than referring them for treatment, right? There's all kinds of negative effects of that. But the alternative is not for-profit corporations selling as absolutely much of this as they can to absolutely everybody around the clock all the time in the privacy of their own homes.
Okay. Well, Rivka, as always, this has been very interesting and a lot to think about. And I hope the listeners take this to heart and start thinking about it if it's something they haven't thought about before. And perhaps you can come up with a good way yourself that you can share with the rest of us of how to best teach this to our children, to our students about what values are involved and why this is something which has to be discouraged. Dr. Rivka Schwartz, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me on, Scott. It's always interesting.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, the Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffeehouse patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers. And you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.